Assalamu alaikum dear students. Welcome to Dr. Roomi's lectures. Today we are going to study sensory physiology. In our previous session, we studied introduction to nervous system, and we have studied the organization of nervous system, in which we studied that nervous system is divided into two parts: the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. And the peripheral nervous system has got two divisions: afferent and efferent division. The afferent division of the peripheral nervous system is the sensory, which means this division takes information or signals from the periphery to the central nervous system for processing. From now onwards, we are going to start the sensory physiology or the sensory division of the nervous system. Under sensory physiology, we are going to study some important topics. One is the topic of receptors. So I'm just giving an overview what we are going to study under sensory physiology. The first topic which we will study here is the physiology of receptors. We'll talk about the classification of receptors, their mechanism of stimulation, and various important properties. We'll also study the important nervous pathways, or sensory pathways, and two important sensory pathways which we'll study in sensory physiology are anterolateral system, also called as spinothalamic pathways, and the dorsal column medial lemniscal system, also called as dorsal column pathway. So in these pathways we'll study what are various types of sensations carried by each of these pathway, and what are the differences between the sensations, the properties of the nerve fibers, and the features of these pathways. Under sensory physiology, we will study the topic of pain in a bit detail, because pain is one of the clinical feature for which usually patients need clinicians advice. So this topic will be discussed in a bit more detail as compared to other sensations like touch, pressure and vibration. We'll study pain and its types and the mechanism and various neuronal pathways which carry pain. The very first topic in the sensory physiology is sensory receptors. So in the physiology of sensory receptors, we are going to first define them. What are sensory receptors? Sensory receptors are ends of nerves or some specialized cells which convert stimulus energy into electrical energy. Here, the receptors must not be confused with the membrane receptors. Membrane receptors, they are the receptors which are present in our cell membrane. They are proteins which respond to some chemical messengers. For example, receptors for insulin, receptors for acetylcholine. Here we are not talking about those membrane receptors. We are talking about sensory receptors, or simply receptors. So from now onwards, when I will be talking about receptors, that generally means sensory receptors. So the receptors, they may be the end of a nerve, or they may be a specialized cell. For example, the free nerve endings, they are the ends of the nerve which sense some kind of signals like pain signal or temperature signals. Some of the ending of the nerve, they may be covered by some connective tissue capsule which we call as encapsulated receptors. So keep in mind the receptor may be nerve end of the nerve, which may or may not be myelinated. And some receptors they may not be nerve, they may be some other cells like epithelial cells, and they are modified to behave as receptors. For example, the receptors for taste in our tongue. So the taste receptors, they are epithelial cells which sense taste signals. And the receptors for hearing, the hair cells in our cochlea, they are epithelial cells. They have become modified to behave as receptors. They are not nerve endings. We need to know what is meant by a stimulus. Stimulus is any change in our external or internal environment which can be detected by sensory receptors. For example, the temperature change in our external environment, heat or cold. This is detected by the heat and cold receptors. Pressure is a stimulus which is detected by the pressure receptors. Similarly, touch and other type of stimuli which come from the external environment. Stimulus may also come from our internal environment, like change in glucose in our blood, change in oxygen level, change in carbon dioxide level, change in the osmolarity. These are all stimuli. Similarly, change in your blood pressure and change in pH of the blood. These are all stimuli. We may be aware of the stimuli and we may not be aware of the stimuli. The examples of stimuli to which we are aware are the general sensations which are detected from our skin, like touch, pain, pressure, vibration, and temperature changes. All those stimuli to which we are consciously aware, so they are carried by the somatic sensory nerve fibers from our skin. And some sensations, like from the visceral organs, to which we are not aware, they are subconsciously carried and detected by our body, like change in blood glucose level, change in blood pressure, change in the osmolarity, change in the concentration of oxygen and carbon dioxide and pH of the blood. So they are all subconsciously detected by some internal receptors in our body. What is meant by modality or modality of a stimulus? So modality is the energy form in which a stimulus exists. For example, touch modality, the taste modality, the sound is a modality of sensation. So modality is actually a stimulus which is having a form of energy. We call it modality of sensation. Sensory receptors, they can be called as sensory transducers, which means that the sensory receptors, they detect the stimulus from the external environment or from the internal environment of the body, and they convert one form of energy into other form of energy, which is electrical energy. So they are sensory transducers or biological transducers, and here they're performing the function of transduction. So transduction means conversion of one form of energy, like electromagnetic energy. Light energy is converted by our rods and cones in the retina into the electrical energy. The mechanical energy, like touch, in our touch receptors in our fingers, that's converted into electrical energy. Keep in mind that all the sensations travel along nerve fiber in the form of action potentials. So it is the sensory transduction function of the receptors which convert the stimulus energy, which is different for different receptors, into a same language, which is electrical energy or electrical potential that travels along the nerve fibers. So the stimulus energy, like touch, pressure, vibration, for different receptors, that converts into the receptor potential. Let's understand what is meant by receptor potential. You see, whenever we give a stimulus to a receptor, if that stimulus is adequate stimulus for the receptor, then the receptor will respond in the form of change in membrane potential. For example, if this is a receptor and this receptor is having a resting membrane potential of minus 90 millivolt. If a stimulus is given to this receptor cell, to which this receptor cell is sensitive, then there will be some opening of the ion channels. Let's suppose some sodium channels open here, and the membrane potential, because of entry of sodium into the cells, that moves towards positivity or less negativity. For example, it moves to minus 65 millivolt. So this change in the membrane potential, although this is not action potential, but this is slight depolarization. So this kind of change in the membrane potential in the receptor, we call it receptor potential or the generator potential. So receptor or generator potential. Generator potential is very similar to the gradient potential which we have studied previously. This is very similar to the EPSP, excitatory postsynaptic potential. And the function of this generator potential is to bring the membrane potential from the resting value closer to the threshold. This value may be less or more. This value is not in the same magnitude, it's graded. It depends upon the strength of the stimulus. If the strength of stimulus is more, this value will be more, and vice versa. So whenever we achieve the threshold value, if let's suppose this is threshold value, then action potential will be fired, and that action potential will be responsible for causing the signal to travel along the nerve fibers so that it reaches to the brain and we perceive it. The language in which your brain communicates is action potential. That is the same for all the nerve fibers, but the stimulus is different for different receptors. So our receptors are differentially sensitive to different types of stimuli. Now let's talk about the uses of sensory information which is conveyed from the receptors along the sensory nerve fibers to our brain for processing. This information is useful for our survival. For example, if we are in a jungle and we see some wild animal, and also we hear the roaring sound of the animal, so the signals from our ears and eyes going to our brain will be processed and will be taken as dangerous signals, and brain will order our body to do whatever is required maybe to run away or to fight with the animal. So for that purpose, our effector organs, the muscles, will be helping us for locomotion. These sensory signals are also important for maintaining homeostasis. For example, if our blood pressure rises, then it will be detected by the baroreceptors, which are located in the arch of aorta and carotid sinus, and the signals will be sent along the glossopharyngeal and vagus nerve to our vasomotor center in the medulla, and the appropriate response will be generated to bring this blood pressure down. These sensory signals, they're also very important for arousal of our brain and for consciousness. For example, when the sensory signals they are sent from our skin, from eyes, from ears, the signals they pass through our brainstem and through the reticular formation. Most of these signals from the eyes, ears, and from skin, they activate the reticular system or the reticular activating system, and that reticular activating system from the brainstem that sends signal to our cerebral cortex, which activates the cerebral cortex, and that is important for our arousal, for our consciousness. This is why when someone is having kidney pain, let's suppose, he is not able to sleep, because the pain signal they're activating our reticular activating system, and then the reticular activating system is sending signal to our cerebral cortex for arousal. Sensory information is also very important for our perception of the world around. How do we see the world around, whether it is cruel or very good world? So it's the function of our brain. So this is the product of our brain. How do we think? The sensory information is from the environment is given to our brain will process it, and then that will give you the perception how the world is around. So the perception of the world, because everyone is having different experiences, so his perception of the world around will be different. The world is same, but because everyone is having different experiences, so everyone is having different perception of the world around. Some of the information which is going along the sensory pathways to our brain will be stored as memory, and that stored memory will be useful for performing some actions later on. For example, if you have had a past experience which was good or bad, that can be stored as a memory in your brain, and that past experience, good or bad, will be useful to help you to modify your action in future. And this is very important for learning as well. This sensory information also has effect on your emotions. For example, if you are sitting in a restaurant and you have ordered food like some delicious pizza, the order of that delicious pizza will be having very good effect on your mood. Similarly, if you hear someone talking some bad news that has some emotional effect on you, you may become sad or angry in response. View of some sights or some good sounds, they may have very peaceful and soothing effect on your body. So it means various kinds of smells, sounds, visual signals, they may have good or bad effect on your body. So yes, they have emotional effects as well. Another important property of receptors is that they are differentially sensitive to stimuli, which means that every stimulus in our body will not respond to each and every type of stimulus. Each receptor is most sensitive to one kind of modality of sensation, and whenever adequate stimulus is given to that receptor, it will respond in the form of generator or receptor potential, and that signal will be carried along the nerve fiber through the sensory pathway to our brain. For example, our tongue is sensitive to the chemical signals, the taste signals. Our ears are sensitive to sound signals. The rods and cones, which are photoreceptors in our retina, are sensitive to the electromagnetic or light signals. Some receptors in our body, they can also respond to some other stimuli if they are given in greater strength. For example, if you put pressure on your eyes, then some stimulation of rods or cones may occur. For example, if someone is hit in the eyes with a tennis ball, the person may see some stars. I mean, there may be some flash of light in the eyes. So it means that our rods and cones, the adequate stimulus for them is the light, because light, even one photon, can stimulate our rods and cones. That is the adequate stimulus for our rods. Adequate stimulus is that stimulus which can stimulate our receptors with minimum energy. And some other stimuli, they can weakly stimulate our receptors with higher strength, like the pressure on our eyes can stimulate our rods and cones to a less degree, but only when there is more pressure given to our eyes. So you can see here that the receptors, they are differentially sensitive to various stimuli, and they are most sensitive to a stimulus which is called as adequate stimulus. Like our tongue is most sensitive to the taste chemical signals. So those taste chemicals like sugar, like salt, they are the adequate stimulus for our tongue. But that salt, when put in our eyes, it cannot stimulate the visual signals. If that sugar put in our ears, do you think it will stimulate our hearing signals? Never. Similarly, light given to our skin will not stimulate your touch, pressure, vibration signals. So here comes a very important law which is called as Muller's law. About 200 years ago, he described a very important feature of the nerve fibers. He said that each type of nerve fiber, when it is stimulated, it will carry only one type of sensation to our nervous system. For example, when the touch receptor and is stimulated, then the nerve fiber will carry only touch signal. So this concept is called as Muller's law, or the law of specific nerve energies. It means that whenever that touch receptor is stimulated, even with some other signal like electrical signal, so the same touch signal will go to your brain. It's just like when our rods and cones in the retina, they are stimulated with light, yes, light signal is perceived. But when rods and cones, they are stimulated with firm pressure on our eyes, a little bit of light signal once again is perceived by our brain. So it means that according to this law of specific nerve energies, or the Muller's law, whenever a nerve fiber is stimulated by a stimulus, there is only one sensation that's perceived, and that sensation which is perceived is the same sensation which is perceived when adequate stimulates that nerve fiber. So the adequate stimulus is that stimulus which will do it with minimum energy required. Like the adequate stimulus for our eyes is light, because minute amount of light like a photon can stimulate our rods and cones, but pressure is not the adequate stimulus for our eyes, although uh, very powerful pressure can stimulate our eyes, but only when it is high in magnitude. For our ears, sound is the adequate stimulus. There is a very important concept related to receptors and sensations, and this concept is called as labeled line principle, which means that which signal is coming from which part of the body, which receptors detect it, and which along which nerve fibers that signal will be traveling to go to a certain part in our brain. So this concept is called as labeled line principle. So this is labeled for two things. Number one, what is the specific modality which is being detected by the receptor? Pain receptors, they detect pain. Touch receptors detect touch. So what is the modality that's being detected by the receptors? Light for detected by rods and cones. And what is its location, where it is coming from? Like the touch coming from our fingers, or the touch coming from our toes, and that will be perceived by a certain part in our brain. So this pathway along which the nerve signals they are traveling, that pathway, it is having two or more neurons in a series, and it is called as a labeled line, and the principle is called as labeled line principle. For example, in case of somatosensory pathways, the spinothalamic pathway and dorsal column pathway, there are four important nerve fibers which are present in a series. So I'll draw a simple diagram. Let's suppose we have a receptor here in our skin. This is a receptor. This receptor, this is usually this is the nerve ending. So let's suppose this is ending of a nerve, and this nerve, this is having its cell body, which is located in the dorsal root ganglion. Here this is the peripheral axon, and this is the central process of this sensory nerve fiber or the afferent nerve fiber. The signal which is detected by from the receptor travels along this sensory nerve fiber, and it goes to our spinal cord. So let's suppose this is our spinal cord. Now the signal which goes to our spinal cord, it may ascend upwards or it may remain uncrossed. It depends upon which pathway we are talking about. In case of dorsal column pathway, the signal ascends upwards until it reaches to medulla, where it crosses towards the opposite side. But in case of spinothalamic pathway, this signal, as soon as it enters in our spinal cord, it crosses to other side. Let's talk about dorsal column pathway. So this signal, this will cross to other side when this reaches to medulla. So this is medulla. So when this signal goes upward into the medulla, it synapses on another neuron, which is called as second order neuron. So the nucleus gracilis and nucleus cuneatus, that is a second order neuron. The signal from here, it crosses to opposite side, and then it ascends upward in the brainstem. It passes through pons and midbrain. Then it reaches to a very important relay station, which is thalamus. In the thalamus, the signal, it ascends upwards, and then it reaches to another level, which is our final perception level, that is in the cerebral cortex. In the thalamus, this second order neuron, it synapses on another relay neuron. So this new neuron which starts from here in this pathway, that is third order neuron. Here this is first order neuron, this is second order neuron, which crosses to other side in the medulla, and here this is third order neuron, which is present in the thalamus. And the nerve fiber which is ascending upwards, that goes to our cerebral cortex, and this synapses with another neuron in the cerebral cortex, which is the fourth order neuron. So you can see here, this is the labeled line, and this labeled line is for dorsal column medial lemniscal system or dorsal column pathway. This pathway, it detects certain sensations like vibration, fine touch, proprioception, two-point tactile discrimination. So this kind of sensation, they are detected by the receptors in this pathway. The first order neurons, they are the neurons which are present in the cell bodies for which are present in the dorsal root ganglion. These nerve fibers, they enter into the spinal cord. They remain uncrossed in the spinal cord. When these nerve fibers, they reach the medulla, then they synapse here on the nucleus gracilis and cuneatus, and from here the second order neurons, they start and cross to the other side. In case of spinothalamic pathway, the second order neurons, they are present in the spinal cord, and as soon as these first order neurons, they enter in the spinal cord, they synapse on the second order neurons, and then they cross to other side. So this is a very important difference between spinothalamic pathway and the dorsal column pathway. Third order neuron, it is present in the thalamus, and the fourth order neuron is present in the cerebral cortex. Although we will study this dorsal column pathway in very much detail in later on, and we'll compare this pathway with the spinothalamic pathway as well. However, the purpose of drawing this pathway here is to show you a labeled line. It means that the vibration sense, for example, is carried along a series of neurons, which is a somatosensory pathway. This is a labeled line. This will inform our brain, which will perceive that vibration sense about the modality, the vibration, and the location where it is coming from, whether this vibration is coming from your foot or from your hand. Similarly, the proprioception, the sense of position, that will also be detected by the receptors, but it will be traveling along other type of nerve fibers, and they will be passing through through a label line to reach a certain area in our cerebral cortex. According to the label line principle, each type of nerve fiber that detects one modality of sensation, so it responds to a certain form of stimulus energy and converts it into the receptor potential that travels as action potentials along the nerve fibers. In the visual pathway, it is the light that travels along visual pathway to go to our brain. Final area in our cerebral cortex where vision is perceived, that is the occipital lobe. The area in our brain where auditory signals, they are perceived, that is the temporal lobe. So it means in different parts of our brain, different types of signals are perceived. The signals of touch, vibration, pressure, they are perceived in the parietal lobe. So I'll explain this concept of labor line principle, giving you an analogy of a passenger at an airport. Let's suppose your brother is coming from overseas to airport, and you have to go there to receive him and bring him to home. So your brother is like a stimulus. So just like the stimulus which is received by the so just like the stimulus which is detected by the receptors, your brother is a stimulus, and you are the receptor who has gone there to airport to pick him up. And then you both will sit in a car, and the car will travel. So just like in a nerve fiber, the signal will travel along a nerve fiber, and ultimately you will reach your home. So home is your cerebral cortex, so your final destination where you will reach. Along your pathway there may be some signals where you will stop. So just like that, this relay station here in medulla, relay station here in thalamus, these are like some signals where you have to stop when you are driving. So in this way you pick your brother from airport, and you take him, bring him home, and you travel along a certain path. Similarly, different sensations travel along different pathways. For example, if this is one sensation, it may travel along this pathway and go to this part of your brain. Another sensation, it may travel along this pathway and can go to this part of your cerebral cortex. So it means all the sensations, they don't go to same part of our brain. Another important concept which I want to give you is the coding of what, where, and how much of the sensory signal detected. For example, what? So when light falls on your eyes, so what you will perceive? It's light. So when light falls on your skin, you will not perceive it as light. Or when light goes to your ears, you will not perceive it as light. So it means what is the stimulus that will be detected when a certain type of receptor detects adequate stimulus, and then along a certain pathway that signal will travel and will go to certain part of our brain. For example, in the occipital area, the light signals were perceived. So this will tell you about what, where. Where means where that stimulus is coming from. For example, if touch is coming from your hands, that will go that will be detected by the touch receptors, travel along a certain nerve pathway, and then it will go to somatosensory cortex in a part. We have already studied sensory homunculus. So in case of sensory homunculus, I have explained our face, our head, that is represented upside down, most laterally, and the legs are represented medially. So it means the touch signal which is coming from your feet or toes, that's upward and medially in your cerebral cortex, in this primary sensory cortex. And the signals which are coming from your lips, from your face, that's downward and laterally. So in this way you will perceive where the signal is coming from, because that signal will be located in certain part of your brain. This is because of the topographic map at which the signal from each part of the body is located in our sensory cortex. And then how much means how strong is your stimulus. For example, it is light pressure or it is deep pressure. So that is detected by the frequency of the action potential which is traveling along the nerve fibers. If there is a weaker stimulus, there will be less receptor potential, and then less number of action potentials will be traveling along the nerve fiber. In case of stronger stimulus, the receptor potential magnitude will be higher, and there will be more number of action potentials which will be traveling along the nerve fibers. In case of stronger stimulus strength, more and more receptors, and hence more and more nerve fibers will be stimulated. They will be taking more signals to your brain. So they will inform your brain that the stimulus strength has increased. Alright, so up till now we have studied some important definitions about receptors. In our next lecture, we will study the classification of receptors. So thank you so much for watching. See you next time.